In this video segment, I will be talking about Bach and the Lutheran Cantata. If you haven't checked it out yet, right after this, maybe you can check out the video about Johann Sebastian Bach and participate in a group discussion about some facts related to his life. But anyways, Bach is the main representative of this genre called the cantata. So in this chapter, we will be discussing a little more about the cantata. First, just a little bit of historical context here. If you remember in the Renaissance, we had the Protestant movement starting, right? And so all those Protestant churches were growing very strong into this Baroque era. And Martin Luther and John Calvin believed in the congregation should join in singing since the very beginning of these Protestant churches. So they composed many of these tunes, hymn tunes, that basically now we call the chorales. And they were simple melodies that sometimes they even borrowed from some folk tunes of the time, because really Martin Luther was not a composer, but they would put some religious lyrics, and he did a pretty good job with that. And some of those hymns, many of those, they were still being sang by the time Bach comes in the picture, okay? We're talking about many decades later after the Reformation started. But anyways, these hymn tunes, basically, as the time went on, more and more people started to harmonize. In many of these churches, as they grew, they started to have professional choirs. So now some people who could sing better, they'll be part of the choir, and the choir will be basically harmonizing these tunes in a 4-part harmony, right? Homorhythmic, like when all the voices are moving together. And so here, let me tell you, by the time the cantata was developed, right, we started to have these choirs singing these special numbers. So basically, this is what a composer would do. A composer will get some of those chorales, some of those tunes, and arrange them into beautiful movements. And that will make it for a special performance during the service, a performance where the choir will present to the congregation some of those movements, okay? So even though the congregation was invited to sing and many other tunes, but the cantata actually became a special presentation by the choir of that church, okay? And as these churches grew, they started to have also composers being hired to be kind of on call all the time, and that would be their main job, to be responsible for the music at that church. So some of those jobs, they were starting to call those composers the Kapellmeister, which basically means a person in charge for the music in that chapel, right? Which will be usually a big church. But anyways, as this genre developed, it became what it is. And here is a definition for you: a multi-movement work for soloists, chorus, and orchestra. Okay, so basically you have a big choir, you have some people who will be soloists, some movements in which will have soloists being featured, and a big orchestra accompanying. Now with the instrumental music gaining force, we see that even in this genre that is a vocal genre, basically. The style of music that you will hear is basically the same styles as you hear in an opera. You hear arias, recitatives, and choruses, with the distinction that here it's a religious work, and it will employ less people probably. The choirs in a cantata in these churches will probably be fairly small, maybe 15 to 20, 25 top people. And so it's different than the opera. Usually 5 to 7 movements, and this will be an integral part of a weekly sermon or a weekly service. So basically, this Kapellmeister will coordinate with the pastor, and what the pastor will be talking, they try to match the topics. So the composer then will choose a hymn that will be about the topic that the pastor will be discussing, and then he will make arrangements of that hymn. So all of those 7 to 5, sometimes even 8 movements will be arrangements of the same hymn. So Bach composed a lot of cantatas, okay, and a lot of them didn't survive. Basically, he was just interested in composing the cantata for the next Sunday. He wasn't just thinking of posterity, and many of those papers got lost. But we still have 200 of those cantatas that survived, about 200. And one of the most famous is actually cantata number 140. And I will be presenting some examples for you in the next exercise, the next activity. And the cantata number 140 is called Wachet auf. Since this is German, it's all in German language, obviously. And translating, it means sleepers awake, okay? So you will hear the fourth movement, which is for tenors. And that particular movement, it was unusual in a cantata in the sense that it's not a solo. It's for the whole tenor section to be singing that particular part. And you don't see that very often in other cantatas. So because of that, and because it's a beautiful movement, that's the chosen one for my example. The last thing I want you to know about the cantata is that those movements were varied in terms of how they were presented. Usually the first movement, just to give you a mental picture of how a cantata works, the first movement will be the longest and the most elaborate, usually very polyphonic, not easy to sing. And the second movement, third, fourth, fifth, you could encounter a variety of things, but a lot of recitatives to be sang by one person, and arias, which could be a solo, it could be a duet, it could be a trio singing the aria, but a more melodic part, right? And the last movement will be for sure with the whole choir again. So the whole choir will sing, and in the last movement, the congregation will actually stand up and sing with the choir. And so the composers, it was basically a tradition, right? Composers did it that way. So the congregation was always expecting to, in the last movement, they will actually raise, stand up, and sing that movement with the choir. Okay, so that's a little bit about the cantata.